And good afternoon to you, Pittsburgh Steelers fans. Welcome to another edition of Steelers Brunch with Tony. I am your host, Tony Defio, and I am very excited that you're joining me on this fine, lovely Saturday afternoon, at least in Pittsburgh. If you're not in Pittsburgh, I hope it's lovely where you are too. And before I begin the broadcast, I just want to encourage everybody to subscribe to the Behind the Steel Curtain YouTube channel. We have a endless amount of podcasts for you each and every week, starting with The Standard is the Standard. Yeah, I said it, hosted by Lance Williams. Steelers Preview, hosted by Jeff Hartman, Brian Anthony Davis, Dave Schofield. The Stat Geek, hosted by Dave Schofield and Big Bro Sco. And of course, Steelers Question and Answer every Monday at 5 o'clock with Brian Anthony Davis and me. And in a regular season, that show is called Steelers Hangover, and it always airs the day after the most recent Steelers game. So I just wanted to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and of course, visit Behind the Steel Curtain, in my opinion, the greatest Steelers site on the internet. You have commentary, you have breaking news, you have daily news, you have film breakdowns, you have everything you need, grades, the whole ball of wax. So I encourage you to read that. To read that page, you will find no better Steelers site on the internet. So hello to everybody, as always. Dennis Sheridan, Gyro, James Grammer, Cree X. Thanks for everybody for joining me. So, just like last week, I have a few different topics I'd like to discuss. You know, again, it's more of a buffet brunch or lunch or whatever you want to call it at noon. So, the first thing I want to talk about, the biggest news of the week, as far as I'm concerned, positive news anyway, is the fact that Ben Roethlisberger released his hype video last Monday. It was released on his account, his Twitter page, and the Steelers subsequently released it, and that's of him throwing several, to quote him, legit passes to Juju Smith-Schuster, James Conner, Ryan Switzer at a recent workout. So, in my opinion, that is the biggest news to come along since we got the news last year that Big Ben hurt his elbow and was forced to miss all but 14 and a half games of the 2019 season. You know, without Ben in there last year, we saw that the Steelers were good enough to hang in there, right? They were good enough to hang in there. They had, the defense took it to the next level, thanks in part to the acquisition of Micah Fitzpatrick, and it became an elite level defense. But as you saw, without a franchise quarterback, it could only go so far. So, provided you have that same kind of defensive performance in 2020, and provided Ben's able to elevate everybody else on offense the way most franchise quarterbacks tend to do, and that's the offensive line, that's the running game, that's the receiving core, the tight ends. If you have the quarterback position right, it just makes so many things better. So I'm not going to sit here and say that Ben's totally out of the woods, but it is another step. I mean, we saw in February where after he finally got cleared to begin throwing from his doctor. We saw the quick little clip of him throwing a football in that gymnasium. I believe it was in California somewhere. So that was a big deal. That was a step in the right direction. And now, you know, you saw the other day he's out there really letting it loose. I mean, we didn't really get to see a whole lot. It was only about a 30-second, 40-second clip, but it showed him running around a bit and just really letting it fly. And I don't know how accurate he was. I don't know how those passes looked once they left his hand, but he certainly was throwing with great intentions, which is a good sign. Now, that's the next step, and after that, I guess it comes down to how does the arm react to official team workouts like OTAs, which I guess are not technically official. They're voluntary workouts, but still the organized team activities like that and mini camp, if there is one, and of course training camp. How does his arm react under those circumstances when he's out there throwing the football dozens of times every single day and every single practice session? So I think that's the next step. And another thing that I wanted to touch on from that video is Ben looked to be in pretty good shape. There were major concerns about his weight gain last year, or his weight in general last season, when you saw him in the gray sweats with the big bushy beard. But even when he was running around on the field in that video on Monday, he still had the big bushy beard. I mean, that was all part of his hype. He said he was not going to shave the beard until he could throw a legit NFL pass, which apparently he did, and as per the video. But even with that beard, he still looked to be a lot slimmer than people were thinking he would look at this point in his career, and at this point in the offseason in his rehab. And quite frankly, as I wrote in an article on earlier last week, here we are, less than 4 months until the start of the 2020 regular season, hopefully. And if he's not out there throwing legit NFL passes in practice sessions, and that's probably something to be quite alarmed about. So the fact that he has taken that step is huge. So I think it's a testament to him. Here he's 38 years old. He's accomplished so much in his career up to this point. He's ending into his 17th season. It would be easy, at this stage to say, look, or not this stage, but last season when he got hurt, to say, look, I do I want to put my body through more rehab to try to get back and play in my late 30s and try to win another Super Bowl when I could just go out essentially on top and I have the credentials to already be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And I realize if he had done that, he would have left a lot of money on the table, like $60 million or so. But he's already made. He's also made a ton of money at this point of his career. He has generational wealth now. So, I mean, he could have walked away. And I think the fact that he didn't, the fact that he's rehabbing as hard as he is to try to make it back and try to be the elite quarterback that we've known him to be his whole career, I think that tells me that the fire's still there, and he's still very serious about going out with another Super Bowl or two, or at least trying his best to help the Steelers win number 7 or number 8 or contend for it. So I think that's just, again, it's to repeat myself for probably the third time. I think it's just fantastic news for the Steelers and their fans moving forward. And that ties in, I think, quite nicely to the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that's Mr. Adam Shine. He's I guess now a more famous talking head. I think he does shows for CBS. He writes for NFL.com. He's on a show, I believe, called Mad Dog Sports or something like that. He does several things, like a lot of these guys do. He's all over the place. And he came on last Tuesday, and much like he did in February when he mocked Steeler fans for being too excited about the little 5-second clip of Ben throwing the football in California, he came on and essentially shamed the Steelers organization for putting out, quote, a hype video in May when they're normally about winning Lombardi trophies in February. And I'll read the exact tweet for you right here. I have it written down, old school. Here's what he said. Steelers used to be about Lombardi trophies in February. Now it's haircut and hype videos in May. He was referring to Ben. Part of that hype video was Ben getting his haircut and his long beard finally trimmed. So that was part of the hype video. Then he goes on to say, this is what happens when you miss the playoffs in back-to-back years, and Baltimore is loaded and Cleveland oozes talent and has a real head coach. Well, I don't know what to say about that other than he's obviously trying to troll there, just like he was in February, and I could see that, if I'm a national person, scribe or a talking head, I think it would be big business to troll Steeler fans because we're pretty passionate, right? I mean, Steeler fans react to that kind of thing. It's like Beyonce, the Bay Hive that they call it. Anytime somebody criticizes Beyonce, her fans just attack them en masse on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. So we're an easy target to troll, So I could see them doing that, but it's clearly always trying to do, because why? First of all, why wouldn't a team that was literally an average quarterback away from making the playoffs last year not be excited about its franchise quarterback, somebody that could elevate it from just barely making the playoffs with an average quarterback to being a Super Bowl contender if he is indeed back to where he was before? Why wouldn't that be a big deal? And why wouldn't the team and the fans be excited about that? They have every right to be excited about that, So he's clearly just trolling, and it's May. It's the middle of May, or at least it was when the video was released. What else is there to do but hype a video of your quarterback? And what does that have to do with anything that happens in February? It has nothing to do with it. It's just a silly thing to criticize people for, and it's just a way to look. You're just looking for attention, and here you got the attention you were looking for. Congratulations! I spent the last 5 minutes talking about it. I wrote down a bunch of stuff because you said that, so you made me work. So good for you, Adam Shine. But it doesn't mean anything other than the Steelers have a great reason to be excited, and their fans have a reason to be excited. Now, as far as Baltimore oozing or being loaded, that's true. But they still have yet to get to that next level. I mean, they should have concerns about Lamar Jackson's ability to perform in the playoffs. As any team with a young quarterback who has yet to perform well in the playoffs should be concerned, right? And of course, as far as Cleveland is concerned, they've been oozing with talent for the last 2 or 3 years, right? But they haven't won a playoff game since the Ravens were the Browns in the mid '90s before they moved to Baltimore. So it's always fun to pick to hope for and root for the new teams on the block. You want, if you're a national person, maybe, I could see where a team like the Steelers, you're sick of them winning all the time. You're sick of them being at the top of the AFC North, and you want to see some different contenders. I mean, the Ravens are more of a traditional contender, but they have a exciting young quarterback. So you want to see them, perhaps you want to see a new quarterback reach a new level, which is always exciting and fun to see in the NFL. And of course, the Browns were the Browns. So they've been a sad sack franchise since they came back into the league as an expansion team in 1999. So it's only natural for people to be rooting for a team like that nationally, and plus they were on Hard Knocks. They made new fans that way. But to suggest that the Steelers can't join those two teams, that Big Ben can't make them an instant contender when they had and I talked about this last week, when they had the defense that they had last year, that is such a dominant defense, one that unless there's a major injury, knock on wood, it's going to be as good or maybe even better in 2020. To suggest that Ben can't join those other two teams is kind of ridiculous. It's a silly thing to say. So that's all I want to say about Adam Shine. And I thank you for the material, Adam. And I look forward to more trolling tweets from you in the future. So that's that subject. And now I have to talk about a really sensitive subject. And I wish I was talking about Adam Shine trolling, but I wanted to delve into the Rooney Rule a little bit, because it's an important topic. It's definitely one that's been pretty controversial, especially since last week when the league sent out a possible proposal where they were going to incentivize teams with better draft positioning if they were to hire a minority for a head coaching job or an executive position. And of course that drew a lot of criticism because it was probably, it was an unfair role for a lot of proposal for a lot of reasons. I think it was unfair to minority candidates because, they would always question why was I really hired for this? And I think it would have created perhaps an unfair competitive advantage for a team that decided that got the chance to move up in the draft because of that, because you're leapfrogging other teams that may have had like the Steelers. The Steelers have obviously an African-American coach in Mike Tomlins. Say they're drafting 15th in the third round and they have their eye on a player, but but this team would have drafted 18th, but they hired a minority coach or GM, so they got to move up to 12. Whatever. It just wouldn't have been. It wouldn't have been fair. So the league they shelved the rule and they shelved that proposal, and what they wound up doing was tweaking the rule, and making a requirement that before, when it was first instituted in 2003, that the Rooney Rule, named after Dan Rooney, when it was first implemented in 2003, it was designed to bring attention to more minority candidates, coaching candidates, and candidates for senior management positions on NFL teams. So it required teams to interview at least one minority candidate for any head coaching vacancy or like a general manager opening. And the tweak of the rule now, it requires teams to interview two external minority candidates for a vacant head coaching position, and one minority candidate for a coordinator position or an executive position, such as general manager, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that's a step in the right direction. And as I wrote about today in an article that was published today, it's a subject that always incites a lot of passion from people. People just whenever there's an article published about the Rooney Rule or a tweet about it or anything on social media, it incites a huge debate, and you have comments that go on for days sometimes. Comment sections that are hundreds long. By the end of by the time it finally winds down, and it doesn't really matter how personal you want to make it for you or for, it doesn't matter what you think of it or I think of it or what anybody thinks of it. It's still, as far as the NFL is concerned, it's a big deal. If it wasn't a big deal, they wouldn't continuously try to remedy the problem. Art Shell was hired by the Raiders in 1989 to be their head coach. I forget who they fired. I think it was, I want to say Shanahan, but it could have been somebody else. I can't remember. But they fired somebody midseason, and Art Shell became the Raiders' interim head coach, and then he ultimately became their full-time head coach after that. And that was a big deal at the time, and it should have been a big deal because it was historic. But here we are 31 years later, and it's still a problem. And here we are 17 years after the Rooney Rule was championed by Dan Rooney, the great Dan Rooney, the late great Dan Rooney, and it's still an issue. So, it's something that clearly has to be remedied, and the tweaks to it might be a step in the right direction. And I was listening to an interview on Tuesday on Mark Madden's radio show on 105.9 DX. He had a former Packers executive, front office vice president. His name's Andrew Brandt. He writes for Sports Illustrated now. He's really, really a good writer. And he shared a story from back when he was talking to Bill Pullman about Bill Polian, the ex-Colts general manager. And Polian was telling Andrew Brandt about the time that Tony Dungy was fired by the Buccaneers in 2001, and how the Colts, immediately knew they wanted Tony Dungy to be their head coach. They didn't want to interview anybody else. He was their guy. And how if Dungy were white and the Rooney Rule was in place at that time, the Colts would have had to interview a minority candidate and hope that Dungy didn't get picked up by somebody else in the meantime. And that's a good point. It's a very good point. I'm sure a lot of teams have good intentions when they're going out to hire a coach. I'm sure it's not an overt race. It's not overt racism when if they said, "Oh, that guy's the guy I want, and he happens to be white." I'm sure that's not what's going on. But my question is, 17 years after the Rooney Rule and nearly 20 years after Tony Dungy established himself as one of the better head coaches in the NFL and ultimately a Hall of Fame head coach, why aren't there more minority coaches out there like Tony Dungy who are viewed based on their credentials and not based on the Rooney Rule or based on anything like that? I can think of only a few. Obviously, there's Tony Dungy, Mike Tomlin, the late Dennis Green, Herm Edwards, Marvin Lewis. And as far as general managers, executives, there's Ozzie Newsome, the great Ozzie Newsome, who did a tremendous job with the Ravens for many years. So why haven't why hasn't the NFL been able to unearth more people like that? That you're not, when you think of those guys, you're not thinking of, oh, they just hired them because of a Rooney Rule. They're hiring them because they're experienced and good at what they do. Why haven't more people been discovered like that? And I think that's hopefully the tweaks to this Rooney Rule will fix that problem. I was reading an article from the Atlantic. It was published in January, and it mentioned that only 2 minority coaches are offensive coordinators right now. Byron Leftwich, the former backup quarterback for the Steelers, and of course Eric Bieniemy, the former running back. He's one of the hot commodities in the NFL right now. He's considered one of the most brilliant offensive minds in football. But why has he been passed over time and time again? He's had 7 interviews for head coaching positions over the last 2 or 3 years, and he hasn't gotten one of them. And then there's somebody like Adam Gase, who, I mean, he was a mediocre head coach with the Dolphins, and now he's a below mediocre head coach with the Jets. I mean, who did he ever beat? Where are his gold medals? To quote the great Kurt Angle. So, forget about head coaches, minority head coaches that reach the elite status. Why haven't more minority head coaches reached the status of how come they haven't graduated into that the quote unquote good old boys network that they always talk about, where coaches are retreads and they get hired over and over again, regardless of how successful they've been? Why haven't more minorities graduated to that tier? It's like what I'll never forget a quote that I read from Denzel Washington, the great actor. Obviously, everybody knows Denzel from the 1990s when he was basically at the height of his leading man powers. He said, "I'll know I've truly made it as a leading man when I get roles for that weren't specifically designed for or written for African Americans." And of course he did. Movies like John Q, which is a great movie, and Flight, which is my personal favorite Denzel movie. Those movies, those roles could have been written for anybody. So until minority candidates get viewed in the same light that Tony Dungy is viewed, or Mike Tomlin. Like Mike Tomlin's been dogged by the Rooney Rule accusations for 13 years, right? People have accused the Steelers of hiring him simply because of that, even though Dan Rooney, maybe a beloved figure in Steeler Nation, always has been, always will be, even though he said several times that that's not why he was hired. Fans still don't want to believe it, and they still want to insist that he was hired because of that rule. He could go somewhere tomorrow if he lost his job today, and he'd go somewhere tomorrow, like the Redskins, which was he was rumored to go to last year, and nobody would question why he was hired. It would be based on credentials. And interestingly enough, if Tony Dungy came out of retirement and became the Steelers' new head coach, nobody would question that it was because of race. They would question, or they would say, okay, yeah, Tony Dungy's fantastic. He's a Hall of Fame coach. I'm glad he's the Steelers head coach. So why haven't more minority candidates risen to that tier? And I think, again, hopefully the Rooney Rule will remedy that problem. So that's all I want to say about that. I know it's a controversial subject, but I just wanted to say my piece on that. And I want to move on to my next subject, and that's speaking of Mike Tomlin. I just his ability to lead teams even through he has his biggest strength, in my opinion, I think the opinion of a lot of people, is the ability to lead a football team through adversity, through adverse times. And I mean, right now, where certainly, the NFL is facing a possible compromised 2020 season. Training camp might not start on time. There might not be any OTAs or any kind of mini camp. Who knows what's going to happen? There might be a shortened season. The Steelers might not be allowed to play at Heinz Field, if the mayor or the governor doesn't feel it's safe, and they might have to play somewhere else. Maybe they have to play in Morgantown, West Virginia. We just don't know, right? We don't know what's going to happen, and every NFL team is essentially in the same boat. It's going to be an NFL season like no other. And the other major sports leagues, Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, they're all facing similar problems. So I'm confident that the Steelers, whatever adversity they face, they're going to be just fine. and they're going to excel as best as they can because of Mike Tomlin. Because if you look at his history, again, he seems to do his best job coaching, his best coaching performances during seasons when maybe the wheels could have fallen off. Like you go back to 2010, the 2010 season, all the off the field allegations with Ben Roethlisberger, and he was ultimately suspended for the first 4 games. I mean, that right there alone, missing your best player for the first month of the season, could cripple any team, right? But yet he kept everything together. He kept them focused. They started out 3-1, and even over the course of the year, there were a lot of problems. You know, there were the aforementioned problems with James Harrison and all the penalties and all the fines, and then there were injuries, and it seemed like the officials were almost allowing Ben to be abused, and he wasn't really getting the calls that other quarterbacks of his ilk would get. And it was a season that really could have fell apart, but yet they were essentially one drive away from winning the Super Bowl that year. I mean, that's how good of a job. I think that was his best coaching job in 2010 until 2019, with everything that happened with even starting in training camp with the unfortunate passing of Darryl Drake. I mean, you heard so many stories from beat reporters that they could not picture anybody else leading the way and keeping the players together and helping them grieve and helping them have perspective than Mike Tomlin. I mean, his leadership, as far as what they were saying, people like Mark Caboli, his leadership skills were invaluable at that moment, you know, because it was a tragedy. And then of course you everything that happened during the season with the loss of Ben, and you know, he wasn't just missing 4 games, he was going to miss the entire season, and they knew that after the second week, and that could have very easily. They could have, you know, people were predicting 6 wins, 5 wins, 6-10, 5-11, that kind of season, and yet he kept them together. He kept them focused. He kept them engaged. I mean, they looked like they were having a ton of fun the entire year. I mean, they, you know, the way the quarterback play was, I mean, they could have very easily been discouraged, especially the defense. But yet the defense never wavered. It never faltered. You know, it just got better and better each year, each week, and they nearly made the playoffs. So, you know, if you listen to Coach Tomlin speak, he likes to say things like, you know, we recognize the challenge. We recognize that this is a unusual circumstance. We're not ignorant to that fact. We embrace it. We're gonna do what we can to meet the challenge. I mean, those are the things that he likes to say. He's always very aware of the challenges his team faces. He never shies away from acknowledging that. So I think he certainly acknowledges that this year could be a challenge for his veterans and especially his rookies and his assistants, his coordinators, everybody. And from a logistics standpoint, from all kinds of different directions, you know, it's going to be tough. But I look for them, based on Mike Tomlin, based on his greatest strength, to keep them focused. I mean, it's funny. It seemed like Tomlin's greatest strength is kind of like Ben's greatest strength as a quarterback. You know, Ben's greatest, he seemed like he's at his best when everything around him breaks down and he has to roll out of the pocket, and you know, and then he makes things happen downfield with his arm. And it seems like Tomlin's at his best when things are liable to go haywire all around him. You know, one of his favorite sayings is "Don't blink." You know, when he's on the sideline, and when you ever hear some of his mic'd up segments, he's always encouraging his players to not blink, to just stay with it. So again, I think that's gonna bode well for the Steelers and whatever adversity this pandemic happens to bring them this year. So I'm confident that if they do falter in 2020, it won't be because of any kind of factors that have to do with the coronavirus pandemic and how that might affect them. So that's pretty much all I had to say about that subject. And speaking of the pandemic, I wanted to discuss something that's probably going to come up. If it's certainly going to come up, I'm betting with Major League Baseball and the NBA, and it's already come up with hockey, and that's the a possible tainted championship for whoever wins the title. With everything that's going on with baseball, the NBA, and hockey, because the NBA and the NHL, their seasons were cut short about 2 or 3 weeks before the playoffs, and now they're both trying to put together both leagues trying to put together a plan for the postseason. I think the NHL finally agreed on I believe a 24 team field, and there's going to be like a couple of cities that act as hubs. So it's going to be an unusual. No matter what happens, it's going to be an unusual postseason for the NHL, and I assume for the NBA if they ever come to an agreement. And I was reading an article on the Nashville Post on Tuesday, I think, or Wednesday, from Nashville Predators player Matt Duchene, I think is how you say his name, and it was his opinion that he, if it was going to be like a gimmicky postseason, if the postseason was going to stray from what the traditional Stanley Cup postseason is like, then he'd rather not even win the Stanley Cup, or he called it the COVID Cup. He wouldn't want a COVID Cup because, as far as he was concerned, people would consider it tainted for infinity because it was won and as he said, a gimmicky fashion. Meaning maybe an extended postseason or a contracted postseason, or maybe teams that perhaps didn't deserve to get into the postseason got into the postseason, that kind of thing. But I kind of get his point, because it is 2020 and social media kind of tends to make everything in the 24/7 news cycle. They kind of tend to make everything a big deal, right? But I mean, if you look at history, I wrote about this on in the middle of the week. The Washington Redskins have won 3 Super Bowls. 2 of them came after strike-shortened seasons. One of them came after a 9-game season, 1982. And the other one came after a 15-game season, but 3 of those games were played by replacement players when the players went on strike. Yet nobody ever mentions that. There's no asterisk around next to either title. Those Super Bowls aren't deemed less than the other Super Bowls. So I kind of get what Duchene's saying, but I think history will be kind to any championship that's won this year by any team, whether it's a World Series, the Stanley Cup, the NBA Finals, or even a Super Bowl. If heaven forbid the regular season was shortened to 9, 10, 11 games, whatever it is, because of the coronavirus, as long as it's the same for all teams, then it shouldn't matter. I mean, heck, the Steelers won their first 2 Super Bowls after 14-game regular season, because that's how long the regular season was up until 1978. And they've won 4 since then after 16-game regular seasons. Are you going to try to say that the 14-game Super Bowls mean less? No, nobody even suggests that, because it's silly, right? Teams used to go to the World Series in baseball by just having the best record in their league. They didn't have to go through any kind of playoff, any kind of 2 or 3 round playoff system. They had the best record. They went to the World Series. They played each other, and there was a winner. That's how it was in football for a number of years too. So nobody ever thinks those championships are any less relevant than today's. So I don't see why history would view any championship won in 2020 in a lesser light. I think that's a little bit of an overreaction right there. So, again, as long as all things are equal, then to me that's all that matters. So, and those are my thoughts on that. And I just wanted to share one more thing, and that's where I'm going to introduce my my first guest ever on the Steelers Brunch with Tony show, and that's this bobblehead right here, Nate McLouth from 2009 or whatever, maybe 2008. I don't remember. He made the All-Star team back then. And the reason why I want to talk about that is because I think in the near future, after 2020 and beyond, it might be a little harder to get people to come to Heinz Field for Steeler games. I mean, Steelers have never had to worry about giveaways. You've never heard them say, the first 30,000 fans that come to attend Heinz Field for a Sunday's game get a Myron Cope bobblehead or a Jerome Bettis bus, whatever, right? They never had to worry about that because they've had consecutive sellouts every year since 1972, which is when I was born. So my entire life, I've never lived in an era where the Steelers home games were blacked out because the game wasn't sold out. So, but with everything that's going on right now, attendance was a bit of an issue around the NFL to begin with over the last few years because of expenses, because people thought it was a much better product to watch at home. They didn't want to deal with the crowds and the parking and the price of parking, which is kind of ridiculous. So that was the thought, that people would much rather sit at home and watch the game in front of their 40-inch flat screen with a beer and sitting in their nice, comfortable recliner. But it's never been an issue for the Steelers to get their fans to buy tickets. Maybe they don't want to show up to the games, but they're certainly buying tickets. But after with the pandemic going on, and at best we might have 50% capacity for football games in 2020. What happens if those people that don't come to the games in 2020 because they're afraid of the coronavirus, or B, they couldn't go because the Steelers gave they couldn't win a lottery, or however it's going to work, or B, they're mad at the Steelers because they couldn't afford the pay to renew their tickets this year because of financial hardship because of the coronavirus that has unemployment so high right now. What if those fans decide, I'd much rather stay home and in the future and just save a lot of money, and then all of a sudden there are the sellout streak ends. Would we ever come to a time when the Steelers would have to incentivize fans to come to Heinz Field for one reason or another? Will we ever have a bobblehead? Will we ever have the first 30,000 fans get this beautiful Steelers scarf, or whatever? The way they do things now, it's like their attitude has always been, because they can have this attitude because they're in high demand. It's like, we're not going to give you a terrible towel. We want you to buy our terrible towel and bring it and wave it. We're not going to give away anything. We don't have to. But I'm just interested to see if there's ever a time when we get to that. Or forget about giveaways. What about heaven forbid, cheerleaders? Just something to bring more fans into the stadium. I know a lot of people were against that, but you just never know what the future could bring. I remember my uncle used to live in Cincinnati in the late 90s, and I would go down to visit him a couple times a year. And it was so funny to see Sam Weich, the former, the late great Sam Weich. He wasn't the coach at the time. He was just a Cincinnati native, and I would see commercials from him, saying, "Come on down to Riverfront Stadium," or whatever, Paul Brown Stadium, and catch the Bengals. You don't imagine Heinz Ward or Jerome Bettis or somebody like that, being on a commercial, encouraging Steeler fans to buy tickets and come on down to Heinz Field. So from that aspect, it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out, with the pandemic and people's fears of being in crowds, and if there will ever be a time when Heinz Field, when the Steelers are no longer able to sell out Heinz Field week after week. I know it seems ridiculous right now, but I mean, I never thought 2 months ago I'd have to go to the grocery store with a surgical mask on. So, you never know what the future may bring. So those are my topics for today, and I'm glad. I want to thank you for listening, and now I'm going to open it up to some questions and comments and whatever you have to say today. Let's see what you got today. Let's see if I can scroll up and find some old questions. Here's one from Donna Nolan. I like where your head is at, Donald. We need to swarm Buffalo like they did last year with their fans, and that was true. I went down to Heinz Field that night, Sunday night game in mid-December, to meet up with Brian Anthony Davis and Dave Schofield and his big brother, Big Bro Sco, and Big Bro's family. They were all there. They were awesome. But we couldn't. We all remarked on how many Buffalo fans were there that night, and I get it. They were hungry, right? They were hungry for. They hadn't experienced any kind of Bills hysteria in quite some time, and they were a legit contender down the stretch, and when you have that kind of when you have that kind of circumstance, you're going to have fans that are eager to travel and see their team. I mean, picture the Steelers not making the playoffs for 20 years and suddenly being good again. Well, obviously, they're still going to be a popular team, you would hope, even after 20 years of futility. And those fans are gonna have the fever again. So I think that's what you saw last year. But you are right, Donna. We need to pay them back this December with a whole mass of Steeler fans in Buffalo for that. Let them know what it's really like to be in a home stadium when it's taken over by road fans. I went to the Bengals game with my uncle and a bunch of his friends back in 2014, and we were in shock because we've been Steeler fans our whole lives, but just to sit in that stadium, in Paul Brown Stadium, by the time the game was over, it had to be 70-30 in favor of Steeler fans. It was really quite the sight to see. So, as they say, Steeler fans, quote unquote, travel like no other. So I definitely agree with Donald. We need to pay them back in Buffalo this December. Here's one from Kathy Ford. Is it even possible to buy season tickets? I know you have to have a license or something. Yeah, you have to have a seat license. A good friend of mine, he's concerned about that very thing because he has season tickets and he had to buy a seat license when Heinz Field opened back in 2001. And like many other fans, he's getting the alerts by the Steelers, and not just the Steelers, but all NFL teams are doing this. They're asking for the money for season tickets, and the problem is if you decide not to buy season tickets for 2020, you lose your seat license, which it's unfortunate. That has to happen if some people just can't afford it because of the pandemic. But again, like I alluded to earlier with the Steelers, that they have the leverage because the list for season tickets is a mile long. And to your point, Kathy, can you buy season tickets? Not directly, not from the Steelers. No, you have to go on the list. But I mean, you could buy them from other people, I would assume. I mean, I'm assuming. Oh, actually, I don't assume. I know there are always season tickets on the secondary market. So that's how you would get them. And then I don't know if they would be willing to sell their seat licenses, but oftentimes people what they do is they'll sell their season tickets for a year, but they'll keep the seat license, meaning the tickets would still belong to them in following years. So that's how you would have to do that. But you can buy individual tickets. Dave Schofield wrote something about that yesterday, or maybe this morning. I think it was yesterday, about how the Steelers were selling individual game day tickets, but they were only selling 50% of what they normally do because of possible social distancing when the season does start in September. Hopefully it starts. So let's see what else we have here. Let's see what else we have here. Please bear with me. I like to scroll through and find old questions because I think some of them are pretty cool. And I can't, it's hard to pay attention to both because I'm just usually focused on a screen. Let's see, here we go. Tony, can we win the North if Ben throws 16 INTs? Probably not. But by the way, that's from Pitman, who isn't a very big fan of Juju from what I remember from our show with my show with Brian on Monday. But can they win the North? Probably not. But you never know. They came within a half a game of winning the North 2 years ago because of even though Ben threw 16 picks. But I don't look for that to be an issue this year, because I think what was pointed out by Behind the Steel Curtain, I forget who pointed it out 2 years ago, is of those 16 picks, 10 or 11 of them were when Ben was targeting AB. And if you remember Antonio Brown, when he was here, he was a handful when it came to targets. He wanted his targets, and if he didn't get them, he was a handful. So I don't see an Antonio Brown type skill set player for them, that kind of ego. So I think Ben's gonna feel free to just hit the open man. So do I think they can win the North if Ben throws 16 picks? Maybe not, but I don't see him throwing 16 picks, because I don't see him facing that same issue that he did for so many years with feeling pressured to get AB his targets. AB, I think, usually not only did he often lead the league in receptions, but he often led the league in targets. So that's not going to be an issue this year, because there isn't an AB. There are a bunch of really, really good players, but no AB, and nobody you're going to have to cater to their ego. So thank you for that question. I think that's pretty much all we have. All we have for today. I think it was a pretty good show. And let's see if I can get rid of the. I always have an issue with trying to get rid of the. But before I sign off, I just wanted to. I'm sure you guys know by now that Jeff Hartman accepted a position with DK Pittsburgh Sports, so he will be leaving Behind the Steel Curtain. He's been the editor since 2015, I think, early 2015. So he'll be moving on to bigger and better things. I think all of us, or most of us, have aspirations to take it to the next level, but it's a hard thing to do. And Jeff, through his tireless work with Behind the Steel Curtain, he was able to take it to the next level. So I just wanted to thank him for being a great editor, and I think I took my game to the next level under him. So I always appreciate that. And before him, I learned a lot from Neil Coulong, who was the editor for many years. And then Michael Bean was my champion, the guy who originally founded Behind the Steel Curtain. He's the one who discovered me, so to speak, and asked me to start writing for the site. So, I've always had great editors, and I appreciate, what they've done for me as a writer, and for what they've done with the site, more importantly, because they've helped. Collectively, they've helped turn Behind the Steel Curtain, again, in my opinion, into the best site on the internet. And more news, Dave Schofield, the great Dave Schofield, who's been the deputy editor for, I want to say, a year, maybe two. Either way, he's stepping up as and taking the job as editor. So I have all the confidence in the world that he's going to do a great job, just like Jeff did. And just like Neil, just like Michael. So congratulations to Jeff, congratulations to Dave, and also congratulations to Brian Anthony Davis, who's going to be the podcast coordinator. Not only is he famous but for his 2 a.m. partying and all his great articles, but now he's going to be a coordinator for the podcast, and I think he's going to do a tremendous job. So that's pretty much all I had to say for today, and I thank you for joining me, and I'll see you guys on Monday with Brian Anthony Davis for Steelers Q&A. And you all have a happy and safe Memorial Day weekend. Until next time.